The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest in the heart of the Ozark Mountains. It was old, with peeling paint and creaky wooden steps, but it had charm. A rustic getaway, far from the noise of daily life. The autumn sun bathed the world in hues of gold and red, its rays slicing through the trees and glinting off the small stream that wound its way through the property. The air smelled of earth and decaying leaves, a scent that felt both comforting and faintly ominous. I had driven down with 3 friends, Mark, Ellie, and Travis, and my dog, Max, a wiry brown mutt with floppy ears and boundless energy. We were looking forward to a weekend of hiking, fishing, and nights by the fire. It had been Mark's idea to rent the place. "It's remote," he'd said with a grin. "No cell service, no distractions." I wasn't sure if that was a selling point or a warning. We arrived in the early afternoon, unloading supplies and settling in. I took a moment to look around the place, noting the thick woods that seemed to press in on the cabin from all sides. There was something about the way the shadows shifted between the trees, like they were alive and watching. I shook the thought from my mind. I was a postman, used to walking long stretches alone, and I'd always been good at brushing off strange feelings. By evening, we had a fire going in the stone pit out back. The flames crackled, and the scent of burning wood mixed with the crisp autumn air. Max lay near my feet, gnawing on a stick he'd found. Ellie was telling a story about some haunted house she'd visited as a kid, her voice rising and falling theatrically. We laughed, though the woods around us seemed quieter than they should have been. That was when Max perked up, his ears twitching. He stood, letting out a low growl that sent a chill up my spine. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, my voice too loud in the stillness. Max didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the tree line, his body tense. The others fell silent, following his stare. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, a shadow shifted, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, blending with the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long and a face I couldn't quite make out. It didn't move, but I felt its eyes on us, heavy and invasive. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered. No one answered. The figure stepped back into the darkness, disappearing without a sound. Max barked, a sharp, frantic noise that shattered the silence. I grabbed him by the collar, my heart pounding. Ellie clutched Travis's arm, her face pale. "We should go inside," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. Once inside, we bolted the doors and drew the curtains. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a hunter or a trick of the light, but none of us believed him. I'd seen something like this before, on a TV show about skinwalkers. Creatures from Navajo lore, they could mimic voices, take on shapes, and lure people into the woods. I'd thought it was just a story, but now... The night wore on, the fire in the hearth crackling softly. None of us slept. Every so often, Max would growl, staring at the door as if something was just on the other side. Around midnight, we heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It moved around the cabin, slow and deliberate. Travis grabbed a hunting knife from his bag, and I took a flashlight, gripping it tightly. Ellie sat frozen on the couch, her eyes wide. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. It came from the back door. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. "Grab what you can," I hissed. "We're leaving." We slipped out the front, moving as quietly as possible. The moon cast a faint light over the woods, but the shadows were deep, and every rustle of leaves made me flinch. Max stayed close, his tail low and his ears pinned back. We didn't make it far before we heard it again, the scraping, this time accompanied by a low, guttural growl. It was close, too close. "Run," I whispered, and we did. The woods were a maze, branches snagging at our clothes and roots, threatening to trip us. Max barked once, then fell silent, as if he knew noise would give us away. I could hear the creature behind us, its movements impossibly fast, its growls growing louder. Ellie tripped, letting out a sharp cry. I doubled back, pulling her to her feet as Travis and Mark kept moving. The creature was closer now. I could feel it, a heavy presence pressing down on us. "Go," Ellie urged, but I didn't let go of her arm. We pushed forward, hearts hammering, until the woods thinned and the outline of a small road came into view. Mark and Travis were already there, waving frantically at a car that had stopped. We piled in, breathless and shaking. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, looked at us like we were crazy. "What's going on?" he asked. "Just drive," I said, my voice hoarse. He didn't argue. As we sped away, I glanced back at the woods. For a moment, I thought I saw it. A tall, lad's dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us go. Then it was gone. We didn't call the police. What would we say? That a creature from legend had chased us through the woods? We left the cabin as it was, our things still inside. No one wanted to go back. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about it. The way it moved, the sound it made, the way it seemed to enjoy the fear it caused. I don't know what it was, but I do know this. I'm never going back to the Ozarks. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods of Maine, far enough off the beaten path that it didn't even show up on most maps. It belonged to a friend of mine who swore by its solitude. "You'll have peace and quiet," he'd said. The perfect getaway. It sounded ideal after weeks of overtime and late nights. I packed up my truck, threw in my tools, some basic supplies, and a bag of dog food for Rex, my black Labrador with a white patch on his chest, and set off. The drive up was uneventful but long, winding through small towns with old general stores and weathered signs. As the truck climbed higher into the woods, patches of snow began to appear. It was early spring, but winter wasn't done with this part of the world yet. Snow dusted the ground like powdered sugar, and the air had that crisp, sharp bite that made you glad for a warm coat. When I finally reached the cabin, it was everything I'd hoped for. Rustic but sturdy, with a porch overlooking a frozen stream. The trees around it were dense, their bare branches stark against the gray sky. Rex leaped out of the truck, his paws crunching in the snow as he sniffed around, his tail wagging furiously. I let him explore while I unloaded. The sound of his barks and the crunch of my boots, the only noises for miles. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it chopping wood and setting up inside. The cabin was cold but well insulated, and the small wood stove in the corner radiated enough heat to make it cozy. Rex curled up near the fire, content after a hearty meal. I sat at the table with a book I'd been meaning to read, the quiet wrapping around me like a blanket. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire again, sipping coffee, when Rex perked up. His ears stood straight, and he let out a low growl that rumbled in his chest. He stared at the door, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" I asked, setting my mug down. Rex didn't move, his growl growing louder. I stood and grabbed the flashlight from the table, my heart beating a little faster. Opening the door, I shone the beam out into the darkness. Snowflakes drifted lazily down, catching the light like tiny diamonds. At first, I saw nothing, just the trees and the faint glow of the moon. Then a sound, a faint rustling like something moving through the underbrush. "Probably a deer," I muttered, though my voice sounded too loud in the stillness. Rex didn't seem convinced. He barked, sharp and loud, his tail stiff. That was when I saw it. A shadow just beyond the edge of the light, too tall and thin to be a deer. It moved quickly, darting between the trees with an unnatural grace. My stomach dropped. I slammed the door and locked it, my breath coming fast. Rex barked again, pacing by the door. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, an animal, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. I'd read stories in those yellowed tabloids you find at gas stations, the ones with headlines about skinwalkers and other creatures of legend. They always seemed ridiculous at the time, but now... The rest of the night was a blur of tension. I didn't sleep, my ears straining for every creak and rustle. Rex stayed close, his body pressed against my legs. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something scraping against the wall outside. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my hunting knife and the flashlight, my hands shaking. Rex growled low, his hackles raised. The scraping stopped, replaced by a soft, almost human whisper. It was faint, but it was there, circling the cabin like the wind. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but determined to leave. I packed up quickly, keeping the knife within reach, in which Rex seemed equally eager to go, his tail down as he stuck close to my side. We headed for the truck, but as we approached, I saw something that made me freeze. Tracks in the snow, too large and oddly shaped to be human, circled the cabin and led off into the woods. My stomach churned. Whatever it was, it had been watching us all night. We drove down the mountain in tense silence, the tires crunching over the snow-covered road. I called my brother when we hit a spot with service, just to hear a familiar voice. I didn't tell him what had happened, though. What could I say? That I'd been stalked by something out of legend? Even now, back in Austin, the memory lingers. I can't stop thinking about the shadow in the trees, the whispers, and those tracks. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was something else. Either way, I'm not going back to that cabin. We didn't expect Maine to feel so isolated. The rolling, forested hills seemed to stretch on forever, and the trails wound through places that felt untouched by time. I came with 3 friends, Ben, Carly, and Travis, for a long hike through a stretch of land near Baxter State Park. Spring had just begun to nudge the world awake, but patches of snow still lingered in shady spots, melting into rivulets that trickled down the hillsides. Our first day was perfect. We hiked through towering pines, the air crisp and cool, our boots crunching over soft patches of earth. The sky was a washed-out gray, the kind of cloudy that made you keep an eye on the horizon, wondering if rain might sneak in. But it never did. By the time we set up camp that evening, we were exhausted, laughing over small things as we cooked over a fire. I hadn't felt this relaxed in ages. Mississippi doesn't have places like this. Back home, I'm used to flat stretches of farmland and humid air that clings to your skin. Here, the air felt clean, sharp even. As a cook, I rarely get time away from the chaos of the kitchen, so this trip was a chance to breathe. I thought about my brother, Jacob, who'd taught me how to hunt. He'd probably love a place like this. The trouble began the next day. We'd gone deeper into the woods, the trail narrowing until it was more of a suggestion than a path. It felt thrilling, like we were truly away from the world. Travis had been pushing for us to try a new route he'd found on some online forum. A less traveled path, he said. That should have been the first red flag, but none of us thought twice about it. We came across strange things as we walked. At first, it was little details that seemed off. Broken branches on trees too high for animals to reach, claw marks in the bark that were too deep to belong to anything I could name. Carly joked that it was probably a bear. But as we pressed on, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded until only the crunch of our boots filled the silence. It wasn't until late afternoon that we saw it. We were resting near a small clearing, passing around a water bottle when Ben stiffened. He pointed toward the edge of the trees. "Do you see that?" At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved, shifting slightly behind a tree. It was tall, much too tall and unnaturally thin. My stomach knotted as I stared. The thing's shape was wrong, almost human, but not quite. It stayed still, watching us, its head tilting slightly like it was trying to figure us out. "Is that someone?" Carly whispered. None of us answered. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but the words caught in my throat. Travis reached for the hunting knife on his belt, his movements slow and deliberate. The shadow didn't move, but I swear I felt its gaze on me, cold and piercing. Then, it darted away. Not like an animal, not even like a person. It moved too fast, too smooth, vanishing into the trees without a sound. We didn't talk about it right away. We just packed up and started moving, our nerves frayed. The sun was beginning to dip, and none of us wanted to be in the woods after dark. But the feeling of being watched stayed with us, an invisible weight pressing down. That night, we made camp earlier than usual, setting up near a cluster of boulders that felt like a barrier. The fire crackled as we sat close, our voices subdued. Travis was sharpening his knife, Carly fidgeted with her flashlight, and Ben kept glancing over his shoulder. I stared into the flames, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Then the sound came. It was faint at first, a low, guttural noise that made my skin crawl. Rex, my old dog, used to growl like that when he sensed danger. But this was deeper, almost a rumble, circling us from the shadows. We froze, our eyes darting toward the darkened trees. The next moment was chaos. The thing slammed into one of the boulders with enough force to shake the ground, its shape barely visible in the firelight. It was close now, too close, its limbs long and unnatural as it prowled just out of reach. Travis yelled, brandishing his knife, but the creature didn't back off. It moved in a slow, deliberate circle, its eyes glowing faintly in the flickering light. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Carly's arm. We didn't put the fire out. There was no time. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, the creature's heavy footsteps echoing behind us. It was faster than us, but it seemed to toy with us, staying just far enough back to keep us moving. We hid in a thicket, pressing ourselves into the damp earth, our breaths ragged. The creature prowled nearby, its shadowy form visible through the gaps in the branches. We stayed silent, barely daring to breathe. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give us away. When it finally moved on, we didn't waste time. We crept through the forest as quietly as we could, the cloudy sky making it hard to see. Ben tripped once, and I thought we were done for, but somehow, the creature didn't come back. We called my friend Sam when we finally reached a main road, our bodies trembling from the cold and adrenaline. Sam picked us up, his truck feeling like a sanctuary. We didn't tell him everything, just that we'd gotten lost and spooked by an animal. But the look in his eyes told me he knew there was more to it. Even now, I can't explain what we saw. I've tried to convince myself it was just a bear or a trick of the light, but the memory of those glowing eyes and the sound of its growl won't leave me. I don't think it ever will.